Hi, all. I am starting off this episode a bit differently because I'm really excited to share with you where I'm going to be next week. I am going to be in Houston attending the Advanced Reactor Summit. This is the 11th annual summit where we're going to be talking about technology and innovation in advanced nuclear. We're being hosted by the NIC, the Nuclear Industry Council, and this event is going to be pivotal for a lot of reasons. Registration is still open. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm starting to scroll through some of the amazing sponsors that are going to be there. I am so excited to be interacting with some of these folks and talking about the industry and what the future has in hold. And not to mention the speakers. Oh my goodness, this is a stocked cast of speakers. I'm really excited because Jeffrey Merrifield, one of my previous guests on elemental energy, also previous NRC commissioner, is going to be there as well. Hey, oh, look, there's Jeff. So if you have any questions or you want to join us at this pivotal event, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm going to be sure to take the website and drop it in the description of the podcast, but connect. Let's see where we can get together. And now, here is the episode with Douglas Sandridge talking about oil and gas executives for nuclear. Super timely.
Today's episode, I am joined by a fellow oil and gas professional who is supporting nuclear. And it's something that makes me so happy to discuss this topic with another oil and gas professional because it's something that's been kind of hidden and tucked away for the last few years, but now it's coming to light. So I am joined by Doug Sandridge, who is leading a movement, which I am going to have him further introduce after he introduces himself. Doug, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Marsha. Doug Sandridge. I am an oil and gas professional. I've been working in oil and gas since the late 70s, and that is still my daytime job, but I also moonlight after hours as an unpaid volunteer advocate for nuclear energy. So I love oil and gas and want to apologize for anything that we've done for the greatness of humanity, but I also believe strongly in nuclear energy for the future.
Doug, you have a term. I listened to your Titans of Nuclear podcast, which was fantastic. Everybody listening, highly suggest that one as well. But it's energy sobriety. And it really hit home with me. Will you go ahead and describe that and explain what energy sobriety means to you?
That's interesting you say that because I said that the other day in front of my wife, and she looked at me like this strange look, like, what does that mean? I've never heard you use that term, but I do use it a lot in energy conversation. And I believe energy is such a complex issue. Even for those of us who've been in the industry for 45 plus years, it's difficult for us to fully grasp and understand the scope and scale of energy. That's what makes the energy transition, so-called energy transition, so hard because it's so complicated and it's such a large industry. And so I don't blame people for not fully understanding energy because even for those of us who do it as a profession, it's very, very complex and complicated. But we have a lot of people that are talking about energy and making energy policy that don't know the facts. And some of them sometimes even appear to be delusional in what they are aspiring to and what they think we should do and can do. And so, a few months ago, I just came up with the term energy sobriety. We need to be a little bit more sober about our conversations about energy. And sobriety means that we are not hallucinating and being delusional about what we're talking about. So I think we need to be sober about our energy discussions.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. But Doug, I'm extremely curious to hear how you became an advocate for nuclear because I was not always sober. I was 3 generations oil and gas and it really wasn't exposed to power generation side. So I didn't have that look into both worlds that you now have as well. So explain that journey, please.
Yeah, I grew up. So obviously I'm a child of the 60s and the 70s. And so I grew up during the dawn of the nuclear age. We come out of World War II and We started using nuclear energy for positive commercial public, purposes, not just for war purposes, obviously. And so I grew up with nuclear energy. So I know a lot of people my age, a lot of baby boomers are supposedly anti-nuclear. And I think that's because they conflate nuclear energy with, nuclear weapons. But the reality is I grew up, I always thought nuclear energy was great. I thought it was a good technology. I assumed we would always endorse nuclear energy. And in fact, when I was in college, I was taking a lot of engineering classes early on, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I declared nuclear engineering as my major at the University of Oklahoma. And let's be clear, I was not a smart guy, and it wasn't because I thought I was smart, and it wasn't because I really aspired to be a nuclear engineer. I just didn't know what I wanted to do, and I had to declare something, and it sounded cool. And so my history in nuclear goes all the way back to my childhood and even in college. Now, in 1979, I was a sophomore at University of Oklahoma, and 3 Mile Island accident happened in Pennsylvania. And the nuclear industry had been on a really downward trajectory for several years before that. There had been a lot of pressure, price pressure, a lot of environmental pressure, a lot of reasons that nuclear was kind of floundering. But that incident at 3 Mile Island was in many ways the final nail in the coffin at that time. And so nuclear was on the way out. And since it really wasn't my passion, so to speak, I quickly found myself transferring into the oil and gas business. My dad was in the oil and gas business, so I'm a second generation oil and gas person. And so fast forward the next 40 years, I never disliked nuclear energy. I always felt like it was a smart thing that we should do it. It's a good, clean, energy-dense fuel, has so many advantages. But when you're in your own job working for 50 or 60 or 70 hours a week, and you have a wife and you have kids, you don't really have time to advocate for somebody else. I mean, I'm just trying to keep my own job and trying to push my business forward. So honestly, I didn't get back into nuclear until 2020. And in 2020, I was starting to, at that time, and I still am, teaching classes at university on energy. And at that time, I was, really keenly disposed to read everything I could, listen to podcasts, do everything to educate myself, because I spent most of my career in oil and gas, but you really need to know the full suite of energies. And even if you're an oil and gas professional, you need to understand electricity, you need to understand wind and solar and so forth. So as an instructor at university, I felt like I had to overeducate myself to make sure I was at least as smart as the kids that I was instructing. And one of those things that I was doing was researching the policy positions of all of the candidates for president at the time. And there was a lot of presidential candidates in the Democratic Party. A lot of them did not have policy positions, and some of them had pretty ridiculous policy positions because they just didn't know any better. But the one that really got my goat was Michael Bloomberg, because Michael Bloomberg is a educated, smart, rich, very intelligent person. I don't necessarily align with him on a lot of issues, but he's obviously not a dumb guy. And on his website, he kind of patronizingly stated that if you elect him president, that we'd have 80% renewable energy by the end of his second term. Well, that statement made my head explode, because I knew that was not possible. He's saying that in 8 years, if you elect him president, he had a plan in 8 years to be 80% renewable electricity. And I knew that wasn't possible, not because we weren't committed to the plan, not because we didn't have enough money or the will. Just physically, that was kind of a ridiculous statement. And so it made me mad that he would say such a thing, because obviously he only said it because he thought it would make him popular and get votes. So that put me on a path of kind of learning more about the reasons that was a ridiculous statement, which ultimately led me back to nuclear. And so at that point, I thought, I don't think we're really going to do the desired decarbonization that we think we want as the United States and as the world. I just don't know if that's possible using wind and solar alone. And it began to occur to me that nuclear is going to have to play a key role in that future decarbonization. So that's where I got back into it. And then fast forward another year from there, we had the closure of the Indian Point nuclear power station in New York. And that made me I was kind of angry about that, honestly, because the reality was that was a very safe nuclear power plant. It provided 25% of the electricity for New York City. It provided probably half of the clean energy that New York had at the time. It was safe, clean, affordable. It was the whole Monty. It had everything. And yet, for purely political reasons, Governor Cuomo shut that plant down. And it just it was the spark for me. I mean, it was a watershed moment, a turning point for me. I said, this cannot happen. This is silly. If we're trying to decarbonize, this is the exact last thing that we should be doing. This is low hanging fruit. We're not even talking about building, new nuclear power plants at that point. I just said, this is silly. And so that got me actively involved in nuclear advocacy. So that's how I got back into it.
Now, Doug, you started a group. Explain the Oil and Gas Executives for Nuclear group and what the goals of this group are, please.
Okay, so it started fairly innocently. I was working with several groups around the US and around the world, to try and stop the closure of nuclear power plants, existing plants. So I was working with a group in Berlin to try and, get them to stop shutting down plants in Germany. And one of the groups that I was loosely affiliated with was the Save Diablo Canyon group. So at that time in 2021, after they shut down Indian Point, there was a lot of concern that they were going to shut down Byron and Dresden nuclear power plants in Illinois, and also the Diablo Canyon power plant. It had already been announced that they were going to shut down the nuclear power plant in California, the only remaining nuclear power plant in California. So I was working with that group. And to be honest, not living in California, I was sort of on the sidelines. I would dial into the weekly Zoom calls and I would listen and I would learn. I'd learn about nuclear energy, learn about advocacy. I was trying to, become a better advocate by my participation. And one day, someone in that group, just simply said, they knew that I was an oil and gas person. Somebody made a statement, said, we know you guys in oil and gas hate nuclear energy. And we know that your industry has a history of getting in the way and actively trying to get in the way of the nuclear industry in the US. And I did not believe that to be true. So I took myself off of mute and said, hey, I think those statements are incorrect. I'm not sure where that's coming from. I think it maybe is widely believed by people in the nuclear industry. But I said, I'm in the oil and gas industry. I've been in the oil and gas industry for more than 45 years. I know a lot of people, and I certainly don't know everyone, but I think that's a misrepresentation or misunderstanding about oil and gas people. I think oil and gas people are very sober-minded. They know a lot about energy. They can respect a good source of energy and energy-dense fuel like nuclear. And so I pushed back against that narrative at that meeting. But after the meeting, I got to thinking to myself, well, maybe my paradigm is wrong. Maybe I need to ask around. So I started asking friends and colleagues, and I couldn't find anybody who was anti-nuclear. Now, there's millions of people in our industry, and so I can't speak for everyone. And I'm sure somewhere there are some oil and gas people who don't like nuclear energy, but they are a very small minority. There are not very many people in our industry that are anti-nuclear. It's just not our industry, but we can appreciate it for what it is, a really good industry. And so originally my feeling about this was I wanted to prove to my colleagues in the nuclear industry that this belief that many of them had was untrue. So my original motivation was to prove that that was not true. But the more I thought about it, I also thought that this could be used as a powerful tool. The advocacy of oil and gas people could be a powerful tool to, send a message to our policymakers that we need a more sober discussion about energy. We need to have better energy policy, more informed energy policy. And one way to bring attention to that was to have people in oil and gas give a shout out to nuclear energy. And so that was originally my motivation. And so I thought, how are we going to do this? I had this idea that we'd draft a written declaration, which I think you've seen. And it's a declaration of oil and gas executives in support of nuclear energy. And it lists, it's a 2-page document. The first page talks about the importance of energy, how important it is to have more energy, not less, how it's important to raise billions of people out of poverty, all the reasons that we need more energy, not less. And then the second page of the declaration basically talks about all the things that we should be doing to support and grow nuclear energy, both in the US and across the world. And so I had this idea, but I wasn't really sure, if it was a good idea or if it would really resonate. And so I contacted my friend Chris Wright, who is the CEO of Liberty Energy. And I'm sure you know Liberty Energy, the frac company out of Denver. And I contacted him and said, hey, what do you think of this idea? Well, he's very pro-nuclear. And he immediately texted me back and said, hey, this is a great idea. Let's do it. So we drafted this declaration, and it took us several months, and it ranged from 1 page to 6 pages. We wanted to get the tone right. We wanted to get the content right. We didn't want it to be too long or too short. But in the end, about a year ago, we finally all settled on the content of this declaration. I sent it over to Chris Wright. He signed it immediately, and off to the races. We had people starting, oil and gas executives wanting to sign it. So we have over 110 executives who signed it, and I'm not actively seeking additional signatories, but every week I get people who email me or message me through LinkedIn who have heard about it, who want to join it. So we're still getting people who want to sign up and participate. So that's kind of the history of how we got there. Now we're kind of leveraging it, trying to use it as a way of supporting nuclear energy in any way we can. We're trying to use it if we go to a meeting or if we've got some legislation that's coming up, then we can use this and say, hey, by the way, have you heard about, a declaration of oil and gas executives for nuclear? These are oil and gas executives who feel so strongly about nuclear energy that they're willing to support it, even though, it's not our industry. And I think it is a powerful message, because you don't see people in the in the solar industry, coming out in support of natural gas, or people in the wind industry supporting coal. So the fact that you have these oil and gas executives who have nothing really to gain by it personally, coming out in favor of nuclear energy, is a powerful message to a lot of people, including policymakers and politicians.
And on International Women's Day, this is my mini me who has just joined me, Doug, sitting on.
How beautiful.
She's got strep throat and she's not feeling the best, but
I'm sorry.
Yeah, she's not unused to mom talking oil and gas and nuclear, though. She hears it quite often.
She's welcome to stay with us on the whole thing.
She sometimes, when we start driving, she starts talking about transmission lines, and she's talking about substations, and she's pointing out the power. I'm like, I'm so proud.
You go, girl.
Yes. Adeline, can you say hi to Doug, please?
Adeline, what a beautiful name. I have an aunt, Adeline.
Oh, well, Doug, one thing that I am super curious about is the integration of nuclear into oil and gas, because right now we've been talking a lot about conventional nuclear power. So large scale, 300 megawatts and above type of nuclear power. But what do you see for the future of being able to integrate nuclear into our oil and gas processes and procedures?
Well, it's so interesting because, as I said originally, when I got into this nuclear advocacy back in 2021, I wasn't thinking about nuclear energy in any way with oil and gas. I mean, I didn't see the synergy there. I was just thinking, that's their industry. This is our industry. We're going to support their industry. But I really wasn't thinking about those synergies at that time. But now that I've gotten involved the last few years, I realize there's so many synergies going on. And I know there's a lot of oil and gas companies that are actively involved in the nuclear industry. As there's several of the majors like Chevron who have invested in nuclear technologies. And so I didn't even realize at the time how pervasive the interest is in nuclear. And I think it's good, because if a company like Chevron is investing in nuclear, I think they have a lot to contribute besides money. There's a lot of great engineering expertise in the oil and gas industry. So I think it's great that there's big companies like that investing. And as we know, BP and Shell have invested a lot in renewables the last few years and tried to go away from being beyond petroleum, that they want to be known as an energy company beyond just oil and gas. And that hasn't worked out necessarily that well for them. But I can see where these companies in the future, you may see companies like Chevron as an energy company in the future, where they're highly involved in oil and gas, but they may also be involved in nuclear energy. And so back to my friend Chris Wright at Liberty Energy, I didn't, at the time that this began, this was not true. But since then, Liberty Energy has become invested in nuclear energy, and they are an investor in Oklo, one of the small modular reactor companies. And so that's just another example of a company, an oil company, who sees their future tied to both oil and gas and nuclear. I know that recently NOV, National Oil Well Varga, it's a large titan of service company in the oil and gas industry. And they have recently announced the formation of a wholly owned subsidiary called Shepherd Power, which is now going to be NOV's nuclear affiliate. So there are a lot of things moving in the nuclear and the oil and gas space. And so more specifically, how can this happen? I think a lot of the big refiners, so the big integrated companies run a lot of refineries that take a lot of energy. They use a lot of electricity. They also use a lot of process heat. So I think you could see that in the future, Exxon or Chevron or somebody who's got a refinery down in the Texas Gulf Coast, instead of using part of their natural gas and oil that they're refining to power the plant, and instead of using a lot of electricity off the grid, they may have their own small reactors, a microreactor or a small modular reactor. That reactor will provide process heat for the refining. It'll provide electricity. And perhaps if they have excess electricity, maybe some of the electricity is actually sold back into the grid and become a power provider. So that's one way. Another way I see it possibly permeating the oil and gas industry is there's a huge push for the electrification of oil and gas operations in the field. Now, some of this has already happened, but a lot of the electrification that takes place right now comes off of the grid. So the electricity comes off of the grid, and so that grid is only as clean as whatever the grid is made up of. So it's a combination of nuclear and coal and natural gas. So it's probably that electricity is cleaner than diesel out on the pad, but it's not as clean as it could be. And a lot of this cleanliness is coming from, pressure for oil and gas companies to be more clean in their operations. They're still going to make oil and gas, but if they can create fewer emissions in the process of drilling, completing, operating, and transporting their products, that does two things. It means that they have more oil and gas to send down the pipeline because they're not using it on pad. And it also helps, from a public relations standpoint. You've got a lot of operations taking place, especially here in Colorado, that are near population centers. And so there's a real push to electrify these drilling rigs and these frac fleets, not only to reduce emissions, but also to reduce noise. So I can see where there could be an impetus for oil companies and service companies, frac companies, to develop their own nuclear energy, small modular reactors or micro reactors, so that they can operate their drilling rigs, their frac fleets, their operations, their pipelines, compressors, all of that with electricity that's clean from nuclear energy rather than, from diesel power or from the grid.
Well, Doug, I think that you and I need to have a follow-up conversation in about 6 months. I want to bring you back on, and I want to talk about the progress that has been made in this space. Is there any support that you currently need right now for your oil and gas executives for nuclear group?
Not really. Obviously, I think we're open to additional signatories on the declaration. I think there's power in having big names like Chris Wright and Toby Rice and others who signed the declaration, but there's also power in numbers. So anybody who's an oil and gas executive who wants to support nuclear energy, we would love for you to reach out to us and connect and get you signed up on the declaration. But I think as time goes on, maybe in 6 months, we'll have some better ideas of how we can do it. But we're just really about general advocacy for energy sobriety, honest conversation about energy, and trying to push nuclear as part of the solution. So it's a general advocacy, not too much specific at this point.
Awesome, Doug. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure hosting you on Elemental Energy. And for all of our listeners, as always, stay happy, but most importantly, stay safe. As an oil and gas professional, I am so excited to think about the integration of what clean power into the sector looks like and the feasibility studies that are having to be performed right now in order to look into some of these integration methods. It's amazing what goes into some of these studies. And if you are somebody who is listening who has an application of possibly thinking about needing baseload power generation at some facility, or if you are even thinking about needing the thermal dynamics or the thermal process of heat for integration into a process application, let me know, because the more support we can generate for this integration of nuclear into our oil and gas spaces, the faster we will gain support with the Nuclear Regulatory Committee to be able to help these projects come to fruition. So I hope you all enjoyed today's show. I am so grateful for Doug. I can't wait to have him back on in 6 months to talk about the progress that has been made in this area of nuclear integration and having oil and gas executives support it. But thank you again. And if you need to connect with him, LinkedIn, best way to do it. Bye, all.